Hello and welcome to the Shepheard-Walwyn podcast series. My name is Jonathan Brown. Shepheard-Walwyn is a campaigning book publisher based in London, England. Our purpose is to uncover and promote new ideas to society's oldest problems. And whilst our specialty is ethical economics, something Anthony Werner, our driving force for over 40 years, has pioneered, we have branched out over the years to other related areas such as the environment and the lives and works of society's change agents. These podcasts promote ideas we're convinced can actually help us build a better society for all of us. So have a listen and be sure to share with your friends if you like them, but also tell us what you think. These are debates we all need to be part of. So without further ado, let's get into the interview. Today's author is Dr. Edi Bilimoria. Edi is joining us for what will become a series of conversations to celebrate and explore his extraordinary 4-volume, 1,200-page magnus opus, Unfolding Consciousness, exploring the living universe and intelligent powers in nature and humans. Edi was born in India and educated at the universities of London, Sussex and Oxford, and he presents an unusual blend of experience in the fields of science, engineering, art and philosophy. He's worked as a consultant in many industries, including oil and gas, aerospace and construction, and he's been a project manager and head of design for major innovative projects such as the Channel Tunnel, London Underground Systems and other offshore installations. A student of the Perennial Philosophy for over 4 decades, he has given courses and lectures extensively around the world. He's organised and chaired several major conferences, and his written work has been published extensively in the fields of science, engineering and the esoteric philosophy. And on top of all of this, he is also an accomplished concert pianist. Unfolding Consciousness is a culmination of a life's work and has already garnered much critical acclaim. In this interview, we discuss Volume 1. The subtitle of which is A Panoramic Survey, Science Contrasted with the Perennial Philosophy on Consciousness and Man. And this is the first part of a 2-part episode. Okay, Edi, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm very honoured to be speaking with you.
Well, we're here to start continue the conversation about your extraordinary work, Unfolding Consciousness, which is an amazing 4-volume work. Now, just before we get into it, is there anything you'd like to open with, just to give us an overview for the listeners?
That would be a good idea, Jonathan. Yes, I would say my central purpose in writing those volumes, and it's a purpose that became much clearer as I was proceeding, was to show that the universe, man and all nature, is guided by intelligence at all levels, and the laws of nature are anything but blind and mechanical. They are intelligent powers. And so the purpose of all this is to show and understand what it really means to be human, and to see the human being in relation to the whole of the cosmos, of the universe, in line with the old saying, man is the measure of all things. And that being the case, to demonstrate, it's always to demonstrate, not just to hypothesize, that man, universe, matter are all moving towards conscious, goal-orientated evolution. And finally, if I may very quickly, I would say, if anyone asks me what are the unique features of these volumes, it's to show, again with evidence, that science, religion, philosophy are all subsumed under an integrated and integral wisdom that points to their source, and therefore to show the universality of these great teachings, known as the mystery teachings, which help in great measure to resolve the many conundrums in science on subjects like consciousness, nature of the universe, and that sort of thing. And by science, I mean physical science, natural science, as understood now. So that's a very quick few seconds resume of about 20 years of work.
That's great. Well, thanks for coming, Edi. And listeners, tune in next week for That's a fantastic introduction. Your book has been described as a tour de force on science and the Philosophia Perennis. And firstly, right. What is the perennial philosophy?
Yes, the perennial philosophy we can regard as the common heritage of mankind. It's the common heritage, but not, so to speak, the common property of the masses. And it's really an umbrella term. And its teachings are known as the mystery teachings of all ages, or the thread doctrine. And why thread? Because it unifies science, religion, and philosophy into an integral body of wisdom. And the great Albert Schweitzer likened the perennial philosophy to the characteristic of perennialism, to a tree that annually bears the same type of fruit, but never exactly the same fruit, which symbolizes that the universal wisdom is always one in essence, but it must periodically be given new expression and communicated in an updated idiom to suit the epoch in question. And the modern epoch, the scientific epoch, of course, is the age we live in. So on that basis, my whole method in developing the perennial philosophy and really everything else in the 4 volumes is not only to display what the philosophy says, of course, but to provide the evidence behind it and to show how science is slowly catching up with these eternal truths. There is a great saying, science is our best ally being the best ally of these eternal truths, which are being discovered and rediscovered through enlightened science.
Wow.
So, if I can just develop that, if you like, a few similes and metaphors for the perennial philosophy. In one sense, you can regard it as an algebraic equation. An algebraic equation is a statement of generalities, which will fit the scenario in question. So the simplest equation is distance equals speed times time. Any speed, any time, and you get the distance. It doesn't matter where you are. These are just simple metaphors and similes to try and understand. Another very useful one is that of a candle. Now, I don't know if you've been to the prehistoric caves in Torquay and Devon, but I promise you that even with a guide, with a torch, when you're in the middle of the cave, he turns off all the lights. And it is a darkness you have never experienced. Even though you know he's got a torch, he's turned off the lights. Panic sets in after about 30 seconds. It's pitch black. Now, I put it to you, if you had even a match, a candle, you would find your way out of that cave if you don't blow it out. So the perennial philosophy provides that light through the darkness, which the great Shakespeare, Francis Bacon, put in Portia's little speech, how far the little candle throws its beams, a statement that Beethoven was very fond of. And the last simile is that of the thread, like a necklace thread that strings together all the beads into one organic entity. So those are just a few helpful metaphors, I think, to help understand what the perennial philosophy is in words. And then you ask why I encourage readers to reflect on their own experience. Yes?
Well, I mean, that was interesting because that's the topic of chapter 1, right? I mean, so you talk about the perennial philosophy, all the ancient wisdom, and you literally go back thousands of years to come forward and weave everything together. And yet the first chapter is all about who and what am I?
which is what the whole point of existence is all about, because it's important to examine our own mental and emotional processes, to read the book of life, so to speak, the book of our own life. And the importance is this, that you can read 1,000 books and you think that what you read, you know. And it's important to distinguish from hearsay and book knowledge from actually gained experience. And the greatest of teachers have said, yes, you can learn from books and teachers, but ultimately, the greatest learning and teaching is from oneself through meditation. To access that all-important witness self, to see that our thoughts and desires need not actually dictate our actions. And this is the whole point of examining ourselves, that we can direct our thoughts and actions, which means understanding the director, who are we, which means to experience the observing self, the witness self, so we can detachedly observe our angers, our desire, our depression, and all of that. And that is important before launching into the various teachings, because then it gives it perspective and we can relate it to experience. Otherwise, it's mere book knowledge.
Mm. And I guess, I mean, if we think about what our conversation just next to your beautiful piano, just about your experience as an engineer in life, as well as a lifelong student of the esoteric teachings, but also the importance that you had of physically interacting with the world and working with people like on the Channel Tunnel and other major engineering projects. I guess that in itself is really you applying your knowledge or your ideas into the world, right? And how you interact with people and how you show up, and the importance of that versus someone who can repeat a text, but they don't live it. They're not kind, for example. Like for me, I was reading one of the recommended readings, and one of the authors said there's two things you need to focus on in life, which is to know God and to be kind. And when I think about it, it's more or less one thing, really, because for me, if you have any insight into God, then you can't not be kind, because that is the expression of the insight that you have. And so if someone says they know God and they're unkind, then you've really got to question their deeper insight, right?
That's very well put, Jonathan. Yes, to know God, that rather difficult term, God. To know the divine self, the divine consciousness, the ground of our being, everything that makes us what we are. It is impossible to know that and be unkind to any human being or any creature on earth. Yes, as you quite rightly say, yes.
And I know one of the things that when you look at there's some criticism of some ideas and that are in the books, is that you do not have an issue with science and technology. The issue is when people focus on science and technology to the exclusion of human values. And it's why, as you say in chapter 1, is that we're physically wealthier than we've ever been, but many of us feel much poorer. So I wonder if you could just tell us what's your understanding of inner poverty.
Yes, most certainly. Most sincerely, I applaud science. And I rarely talk about my personal self, so to speak, in public, but whenever people criticize modern science and modern medicine, the first thing I point out is these two eyes that are looking at you, Jonathan, were saved by modern science, by modern medicine, when I was 14 years old, because I had a corneal problem. It was not saved by homeopathy, acupuncture, spiritual science. It was science that saved my eyesight. So dare you criticize science, it has done wonderful things to us. But we have to realize, as the great sage Paul Brunton says, that physical science, used wisely, will result in the physical release and expression and flowering of humanity. Physical science misuse will result in his downfall. And you don't have to ask me for examples of weaponry and pollution and all of that. So I love science, but when it's taken to the level that it has now, it results in what I do call inner poverty, which means a starvation of our inner riches, meaning a loss of our sense of values, what gives our lives meaning and purpose, and our essential sense of self and capitals. And that loss of essential sense of self results in a rather poor compensation, which is an accumulation of money or escapism through drugs, sexual indulgence, time wasting, entertainment, where the individual attempts to fill an inner vacuum with sensory distractions. The two seminal books on this looming problem of excessive reliance on science and technology, one by Carl Jung, Modern Man in Search of a Soul, Paul Brunton, The Spiritual Crisis of Modern Man. And I think a good example of the polarity between outward riches and inner poverty are the many modern teenagers glued to their electronic gadgetry, jumping from pillar to post, not knowing what to do with their lives. So also the billionaires and the oligarchs and the power-hungry politicians in the world. What would they do with themselves if they were by themselves in a comfortable 3-star hotel in the countryside? What would they do without their super yachts and their private jets and all the other playthings they have? So to be able to possess things sensibly, but not to be possessed by them, is one of the signs of inner riches. To be happy in any circumstance, I don't mean some idiotic thing like being tortured or starved, but to be left with oneself and yet to be content is a sign of inner riches. And far, far be it for me to, be boastful, but if I'm by myself, as I often have to be and need to be, I will often play in my mind a great piece of music by Beethoven or Chopin or Liszt or Schubert, which is incredibly uplifting. So inner riches is really what we want to develop. Initially in life, we need outer riches to establish the family and the house and all the rest of it. But then we have to transfer from outer riches, which are important, to the inner riches. The outer riches will fall off. The inner riches will always stay with you.
Well, there's some interesting research from Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who wrote the book on flow states and was also one of the pioneers of positive psychology, along with Marty Seligman. And one of the things that he talks about, and from his research, is that wealth, if you spend your money on things, then it tends to decrease life satisfaction. But if you spend your money on enhancing experience, then yes, that tends to create more happiness, and especially experience with people you love, which was the real thing to spend your money on. But things just create actually more poverty because you realize that your thing isn't as good as the other person's thing. So then you think, I have to get another thing that's better than this thing in order to be happier, rather than say, you know what, I'm going to strip everything back and and we spoil endeavors which could be deeply enjoyable and satisfying, like, for example, the game of golf. And instead of it being some kind of technological war, it's really a game for yourself and the environment, isn't it, really, which is the essence of what golf is really about. And you only can access that if you focus on the game and not the equipment.
Yes, on the process and not the end game.
Yes, yeah.
And on that quick note of experience, I received a company award, and I was given the choice of, do you want something, from PC World or whatever, or an experience? I chose a microlight flight.
Wow.
And I'm looking forward to it. So we better get some podcasts before my microlight flight. I've done a lot of gliding. I got a bronze C for 50 solos and other attainments.
Yeah.
And I just do love flying, and that's the experience.
Yes. Wow, fantastic. So Eddie, your book is split up into, the first book is broadly split up into two parts.
Yes.
You look first of all at the challenges and problems within science, but what you then look at is actually what's emerging in the scientific field that could actually link to the perennial philosophy and act as a bridge. And then you then look at an introduction to the mystery teachings of all ages, and the new continent of thought. So I just wondered if you wanted to take the conversation in two parts, really. And we start with the wonder and problem with the current science, and also what you describe as scientism. And so if we look at that, so chapter 2, when we look at that, it presents the latest claims about the nature of mind and consciousness from science. And so firstly, what is the mind-brain thought problem? And why do Nobel scientists disagree?
At the very least, Jonathan, the disagreements show that the problem is far from settled. And the disagreements are to do with the diametrically opposed views of those who maintain that thought is generated or produced by the brain. For example, Nobel scientist Francis Crick and his school. And diametrically opposed from Gerald Edelman, another Nobel scientist, who argues that to reduce our entire experience, our joy, our sorrow, our feelings of falling in love, our aspirations, our depressions, to reduce all of that merely to neuronal oscillations across the neocortex between 40 and 60 hertz, in Francis Crick's book, that's simply silly. So it is a failure to distinguish between an active principle from its vehicle of expression. No one says the brain is not involved, but how is it involved? And that I'll deal with in chapter 6 when we come on to William James and that. So reductionism ceases to be a valuable technique in science, and it becomes an ideology upheld by faith rather than reason. And reason dictates that the sum, that the combination and the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. So this is the soft problem of consciousness, the soft problem being reductive physicalism, so to speak. The soft problem, the brain generates consciousness, and the hard problem, first formulated by David Chalmers, the Australian physicist or neuroscientist, in those terms, that there is more to it than the brain just generating consciousness.
You get into some of the other things. So, for example, so I'm sure a lot of listeners would be thinking, well, my thoughts are generated by, if my thoughts are not generated by my brain, then where do they come from? Did you want to wait until the later conversation?
If you like.
Okay.
Or, yeah.
So we've got that. Then so there's the other things that you talk about in chapter 1, really, which is looking at natural selection And is it the sole evolutionary process, for example? And the question that you ask is, do genes alone explain genius?
Sure. Right. Natural selection is part of the process. And regarding genes, no more than individual components of a car can explain how the car as an entity operates, or how the components are put together and fit together. So understanding the nuts and bolts of the mechanism provides no understanding of how the mechanic put it together, and certainly not who designed the mechanism, and least of all, the driver of the mechanism. So what is a gene? It's composed of DNA or RNA and forming part of a chromosome. As a unit of heredity, genes certainly determine our physical characteristic, yes, but in the final analysis, a gene is merely a chemical. Yeah, a gene in Western medical science is merely a chemical. Can all life be reduced to chemistry? And if it is genius merely the interaction of chemicals?
So I'm just getting a sense here that when you talk about, so sometimes, for example, it could be, as we'll get into, that my brain could generate thoughts. And likewise, my genes could impact my development. But as we're finding with genes and genetics, is that my genes can be stimulated and triggered by what happens in my environment, which is now the field of epigenetics.
Exactly so.
So it's that interaction that isn't addressed in the reductive approach to science, which is, if I can take something apart, it means that I understand the whole rather than I've just taken it apart. What we really need to be asking the so-called scientists, or the mechanic that can take an engine apart, is okay, sport, now put it back together and make it run better.
Yes. The reductive approach has tremendous uses, and it's invaluable. And not only in science, in any endeavor. If you're learning a piece of difficult music, you break it down into chunks.
Yeah.
You break each bar. I mean, I've done that all my life. But then you got to put the bars together, and we forget this. And I think Ilya Prigogine, the great Nobel scientist who developed non-equilibrium thermodynamics, said, we've become so expert at breaking things apart, we forget to put them together again. So I'm constantly emphasizing, Jonathan, that every approach is invaluable in its context. But when it becomes the driving force at the expense of everything else, then it turns into an ideology and loses the plot, so to speak.
Yeah. And the other thing that you also stress in the thing is that there's a great deal of contradictory evidence in lots of areas around science, and yet it's often ignored because it doesn't fit the prevailing view.
No, it doesn't. And that's to do with the politics of knowledge, which is something that we're addressing a lot in the Scientific and Medical Network. The politics of knowledge, the fear of looking foolish amongst our peers, for stepping out of line, loss of grant and position. You mentioned Ian McGilchrist in the foreword to the Galileo Commission of the Scientific and Medical Network. He states that science is now practiced almost like an industry, factory fashion. And any scientist who steps out of line will find his career on the rack. And even an established scientist has a lot to lose if he steps out of line, let alone a young scientist who's just embarking on his career. But regarding contradictory evidence, slightly more sort of philosophically, the important point to ask always is, through which eyes am I looking? Through which eyes are we looking? Let's think of St. Paul. And Plotinus, of course, said the same thing, of course. that for they that are after the flesh do mind the things of the flesh, but they that are after the spirit do mind the things of the spirit. And quickly, I can give you two examples of that. The great Nobel scientist, Steven Weinberg, who says in his book, Dreams of Final Theory, gone are the days when we can celebrate the glory of the heavens and look at the stars and see divinity. We can't celebrate divinity in the stars with David as we used to, because science now tells us that the stars are really glowing spheres of gas where the gravitational collapse of matter is held in equilibrium by the heat, the upthrust, the heat generated by thermonuclear processes in the core of the star. So the star tells you no more about divinity than the sticks and the stones on the ground around you. Well, that's true at the physical level. That's not untrue, but it's looking through one set of eyes. Now let's look through another set of eyes. When Galileo invited Monteverdi to look through his telescope, of course, Monteverdi saw glowing gas, but he saw more. He was moved to write his beautiful work, The Vespers, the sacred work. So Monteverdi was looking through spiritual eyes as well as his physical eyes. So the differences between the various scientific expert opinions is not only to do with fear, power, position, not wanting to look foolish, but also very much to do with through which eyes are they looking.
Mm. Mm. And I think that leads us very beautifully into there's a quote you have from David Lorimer, if it's okay for me to read it. Scientists do not always recognize that science is based on a number of key philosophical assumptions that underpin, define, and even restrict the scope of its thinking. When scientists define science in exclusively mechanistic and materialistic terms and refuse to acknowledge the validity of other ways of knowing, they transform it into a dogmatic ideology of scientism.
Yes.
And I think when you look at that, of course, so in a sense that it's actually a deeper spiritual truth to say that sticks and stones are as beautiful as the stars. And I know some of the recent pictures coming out of the very latest telescope, which is utterly remarkable in its imagery. And there is that, but there's a wonder that as a gardener, of course, I have a passion flower in my garden. And I think the flowers are the most outrageous. It's just the most outrageous showing off of nature, that nature can produce something so structured. And yet at another level, a blade of grass is an equal miracle in terms of, the creative force behind it. And it's just another expression of a beautiful thing. It doesn't look as beautiful by our definition, but it's still the most extraordinary thing. And it's still something that, after all these years, that we're not able to create in a laboratory ourselves. We can take a seed and adapt it and change it and modify it, but we're not able to create a seed on its own.
Exactly so, Jonathan. We can analyze the chemicals to the nth degree, the same with an amoeba. But why can't we put those chemicals together in the same proportion and create a blade of grass or an amoeba? Yes.
Yeah, and I just think that, and having that level of awe at the utter majesty, however great my garden is, I'm still a servant to a creative force that I cannot even approach. In terms of wonder and power. Even a simple bamboo plant, which my garden's full of bamboo, you just can't get anywhere close to it. I mean, and so in that sense, other than a quiet worship or a very deep appreciation, then I should just carry on digging, and helping the plants find the environment that's best for them. So in this, with this, as you move on with David Lorimer, you look at the whole area around materialism and physicalism. I just wonder if you'd like to give us a quick introduction to what they are.
Yes, let's sweep together materialism, physicalism, and quantitative, qualitative, and soft and hard problem, because it's all, sorry, part and parcel of the same issue. Part of the mainstream scientific paradigm or the worldview, which is essentially mechanistic. The world view that as the universe is essentially a machine, so human beings are machines. Now, how has this come about? Schrödinger, one of the greatest scientists, in my opinion, after Newton and Einstein, of course, and a great mystic as well, explained it very succinctly that in the 19th century, there was an explosion of scientific thought and discovery. Wonderful. It developed, it resulted in the development of material. There was, as a result of scientific discovery, material development. But then that material development morphed into an attitude of materialism, that because we create machines and ever better and more powerful machines, we are machines. So this mechanistic belief about life is a legacy of the 19th century explosion in science, and it is nothing more than a belief. So what is materialism, physicalism? Let's just deal with materialism and physicalism. Physicalism is the modern scientific word, exclusively based on the assumption of classical physics that matter is the fundamental and only kind of substance in nature, the fundamental, and that the emergence of life and all phenomena, including mental phenomena and consciousness, are ultimately the result of matter acting upon matter according to the immutable laws of physics and chemistry. Physicalism is a more sophisticated identification with the most basic substance that exists, but it has a greater meaning than matter, because physicalism is also the belief, and it is no more than an unsubstantiated belief, that physical nature is all that exists, and all things supernatural therefore do not exist. And the word physicalism came into being as a result of further discoveries in science about the interconnection between matter and energy, about non-locality in quantum physics. But it still is a belief that the primary substance of the universe is matter, is physical matter.
Well, I mean, I guess on one level, it's true, right? Or we can act as if it is true. I'm guessing that when you were, helping to build the Channel Tunnel, you weren't focusing on the non-locality of the non-locality of properties or atoms or whatever. It's like you're focused on the physical, and so in that sense. But the other thing, I'm just thinking back to what you said about the 19th century, and that the explosion in technology around the creation or the extraction of material, is that links us back to what you said about chapter 1, which is yes, we need to have a level of physical or material prosperity or sufficiency, but it also needed to be contextualized in the what for. Why do we want that, and why do we need that? It's actually so that we can cultivate inner wisdom and be free to do that.
Yes. So your question embraces a few things. Firstly, the distinction between primary qualities and secondary qualities. But since you mentioned the Channel Tunnel, at my fan museum launch, Professor Bernard Carr mentioned that the Channel Tunnel, in one sense, has linked the two consciousnesses of England and France by virtue of that connection. But let's think of an example. We have to deal with our mental models. Let's think of this example. I make it a point every day to go walking, jogging, running around my local lake, which is very fortunate and very beautiful. I'm very lucky to have it. And there is a playground there. And I love to watch the children enjoying themselves. At that age, you see nothing but pure joy and pure fun. Before all the problems of growing up and becoming a teenager set in, you see pure joy. Now, let's assume, as an example, a little child goes down on a slide and knocks a tooth out. Say, so the slide manufacturer obviously designed the slide wrongly, at too steep an angle. So to redesign the slide, he has to deal with pure physics, the translation or transformation of potential energy to kinetic energy. The child on the slide can be a mass, it can be a stone, it could be anything. It's mass coming down a slide. That's all, neglecting air friction and that sort of thing. So to redesign his slide, kinematics, physics. Now, say the child knocks her tooth out and goes to the dentist. Now, the dentist will obviously look at the child as a human being, but for his job, the tooth is an object. It is a physical object. So his mental model as a dentist is, I'm dealing with a physical object according to the laws of physics and chemistry and biology. The tooth is an object, not the child. The slide manufacturer is very interested in the weight of the child coming down. I mean, a hunking grade 10-foot man is not going to be part of his problem. A child weighing, I don't know, 3 stone, 42 pounds or whatever, is very much his problem. The dentist isn't going to say, what's your weight? Are you 3 stone? He's not concerned. He's concerned about the tooth. Now, say the child then grows up to be a teenager and has psychological problems, go to the psychiatrist. Will the psychiatrist say, what's your weight? Are you 3 stone? You look 9 stone now. Well, that's a nice weight for a lady. No, he's not interested. He is interested in your internal geography, your internal soul quality, what's driving you as a person. So the mental model of the physicist, if it's confused with the mental model of the psychiatrist, then you're going to have problems. If the psychiatrist is going to say, let's apply the laws of physics and chemistry to see what's going on in your soul, you know, he's just going to be talking nonsense. But this is what's happening, trying to reduce the soul or explain it away in terms of physics or chemistry. And if that doesn't apply, it's non-existent. So we have to use our mental models. So going back to David Lorimer's quote, it's pure good science for the slide manufacturer to redesign his slide. He'd be using scientism if he used the same principles as a psychiatrist to understand the soul of that teenage girl.
Yeah.
That's a bit of a arbitrary example, but I hope.
Well, I mean, but as I see, I think it's a wonderful example of the power of the principles at one level. So you're looking at it's a physics problem and its equations and everything else. But if you look at the designer of the playground,
yes,
how can I maximize the enjoyment for the child? Then I would look at the interactions between the different rides. And also the other thing that's also important as a parent is the positioning of benches and access for parents, so that they can also ensure that the child is safe, and if they do fall over and knock a tooth out, you can be there in a fast process. And likewise, I had a dentist when I was a kid who I recall, who only cared about the objects in my mouth and gave no thought to me. And we used to be absolutely terrified of going to the dentist, because we really were just, you know, things to be manipulated in our mouths. And yet the later dentist that we now have takes into account an element of the psychologist and makes the environment and made the environment much more friendly for our children, even play cartoons in the waiting room and things like that. So there's that wonderful,
you as a whole human being,
isn't it? And it's that intricative process that you talk about, which uses science and uses all the other elements, adjacent fields of wisdom and insight, in order to think, well, it's human first. And that's really what we're looking at, is enhancing the human experience And that's really what you're looking at for the great designer of a fantastic playground, or and one that also, I guess, looking at the playground is one that it becomes progressively more difficult, so that older children can still enjoy it. So you've got siblings and everyone else just making the most of the playground.
And in one of the chapters, I again celebrate science and say we should fall on our knees and thank science for anesthetics when we go to the dentist. And who would like to have surgery without being made unconscious?
And I mean, and you talk in your book as well about Goethe and Goodwin and other scientists who take a more systemic or holistic view of science.
Yes, in very broad terms, Goethe, Brian Goodwin, Luigi Fontapé, who coined the word syntropy, they take a holistic view. They regard nature as a living being rather than a detached object, which links in very well to the latest or the enlightened quantum physics, especially John Wheeler of Princeton University, whose famous quote was, or paraphrasing it, that we should not look at nature in a detached way behind a thick glass wall, but participate in her living processes. So the two approaches are the scientific one, small s, not to be disregarded, of looking at nature as a detached observer, and on the other hand, like Leonardo and the modern scientists, looking at nature as a living being and therefore participating in her living processes. So as a rather silly example, if I want to understand my neighbor, I can do it in two ways. If I drag him in, put him on my kitchen table and cut him up into bits and pieces, I can find out how much he weighs and all the various dimensions. But in order to know him, I've got to interact with him. So we can find out the structure of a butterfly's wings by unfortunately killing it and dissecting it, but we will not understand how a butterfly flies unless we can, in our minds, be one with the butterfly and participate in its joy of flight.
Yeah. Do you know, and there was a quote. There was a wonderful author that, as part of the Shepheard-Walwyn group of authors, who wrote a book about sexual selection, and we talked about.
Oh yes, I know.
and you talked about Goodwin, and he challenged the exclusively neo-Darwinist reductionism, which saw organisms simply as carriers of selfish genes, and instead, Goodwin emphasized the importance of their self-organizing power, complexity and creativity, and having grasped the whole organism is always greater than the sum of its individual components. And I remember that conversations that you hear with evolution biologists about the peacock's tail, and it was basically a way of attracting a mate. And yet I was looking at that. I was doing the research for this conversation, and I was watching a video of a peacock open its tail. And the idea that a peacock would go to all that trouble just to excuse, to speak crudely, the idea to go to that trouble to have a shag it's so ridiculous. It looks to me like it was if, let's just say that's just a thought experiment. God or universal intelligence says to all the beings and entities in the world, I want this place to be an inspiration to everyone who comes. I want to create bewilderment or excitement and just what the hell is thatness? If you look at a peacock's tail or a passion flower or something else like that, is that you look at it and you just think, what the hell is that about? What kind of majesty? And as an idea, it just looks to me like evolution or energy or consciousness was showing off and just say, look, guys, take a look at this. If ever you feel down, if ever you feel disconnected from the world, just look at the peacock opening its tail and realize there is so much more to this than just wanting to find a mate, or
Yes.
you know.
And peacocks, I believe, do open their tails when there's no mate around.
100%, yeah.
It's celebrating the beauty of being a peacock. Now, you mentioned the peacock. Interestingly, one of the issues in evolution is why and how did the giraffe have such a long neck? Well, without going into the ins and outs of it, in order for that to happen, there has to be a whole orchestration. It's all very well to say, so you can eat the leaves on a higher tree, but why does it choose a higher tree? But also, for the giraffe to have that long neck, a lot of things have got to come together as an orchestra. The head has got to be much lighter, because on the end of a long cantilever neck, a heavy head is going to create muscular problems. The heart has got to increase its pumping to send the blood to the top. Also, the valving in the neck has got to adjust, so when the giraffe puts his neck down, all the food doesn't go tumbling out. But these things don't happen sequentially. They come together as an orchestrated intelligence. And it's not just because he wanted to get leaves on top.
It's just too much work. I mean, why would you do that? Again, it's just God showing off.
Yeah, it is.
Our actors, it's just inspiration for me. That's and I know it's you can look at the reductionist approach. It's like, it does this and this, but what it takes away is the sheer majesty and befuddlement that the extraordinary creature that we call a giraffe can stimulate if you allow yourself just to look at it.
To be one with it, yes.
Isn't it? And to admire the utter magnificence of that creature. And like I say, yes, I mean, so the engineering problems that entity solve in order to be like that, or the maintenance that a peacock has to go to in order to maintain a tail for its own enjoyment or for an occasional, transference of genetic material. Why bother? Just become, so that there's easier ways of solving those problems, right? And nature is a wonderfully efficient mechanism for creating exquisite solutions that are wonderfully elegant and simple, and that is not a simple solution, so there has to be something else to it, in my opinion. But anyway, just fascinating stuff.
But very quickly, the great Isaac Newton, who is so wrongly accused of advocating the clockwork universe, which is absolute nonsense. Let me just quote, if I can remember his wonderful saying. He says, "Thus this earth resembles a great animal, and it draws its ethereal breath for its daily refreshment and vital ferment, and transpires again with gross exhalations." So Newton's really talking about the earth as a living Gaia.
Yes. And my understanding of the whole thing about Newton and the clock is that he was saying that, well, it is a Gaia. It is it's so much more complicated than I can handle. So let's pretend that it's a clock, and we'll just work on some problems that we can handle, because
on the bigger mechanical side.
Yes, the bigger problems we can't solve. So I can reduce it to an extent, but let's recognize that this is the utter magnificence. And given that he was actually primarily an alchemist, and also so. The other thing that I remember about when you talk about Newton is the way in which he subjected himself to experiments.
Yes.
The idea that, his eye experiments how a man could do that to himself are just utterly staggering, of, squashing his own eyeball with what's essentially with a lollipop stick, wasn't it? It wasn't a lollipop stick, but that's what in modern terms.
Your bodkin, knitting needle.
Yes. And so in that sense, it's that, okay, so if you're willing to do that for science, then and it is also as well, and create that connection of between this magical matter of how the universe produces such extraordinary things that we can't even get close to.
But his laws were a mathematical formulation of the mechanism. He didn't say it was a mechanism, it was a mathematical formulation.
Now, you talk in your book really about the idea of, and going back to this idea of where does thought come from, and what is the brain and the mind, and you talk about the different types of interaction that the brain can have. If I get it right, as a radio receiver, as a transceiver.
Transducer. Yeah.
I just wondered if you could take us through that idea, because I was really taken with that and again, just the idea that you're not saying no to any idea in science, whether it's Francis Crick's idea or anything else. It's just that there's a bigger set of ideas that integrate the ideas at the lower levels of my brain having a thought, or me having a thought in my brain. It's just that there's far more to it than that.
Yes. I think one of the most wonderful insights comes from William James, who delivered I think, if I'm not mistaken, the great Edinburgh lectures on mental science, or was that Thomas Child? But anyway, William James, known as the father of American psychology. And he, in his paper entitled Human Immortality, note the words human immortality, questions what he calls the popular and conventional view that thought is a function of the brain. And he says, yes, thought is a function of the brain, but what do we mean by a function of the brain? There are three kinds of functions. Productive function. Productive function as steam is produced by a kettle. A hydroelectric effect turns the turbines round and produces electricity. That's productive. Another function is not productive but permissive or releasing. And William James gives the example of the crossbow releases the arrow. The crossbow does not produce the arrow. And the third one, most important, is transmissive, the filtering one. Now, dealing with the permissive, the releasing, counterintuitively, it has been shown quite clinically, almost clinical studies, that high levels of creativity are to do with a lowering of the brain threshold, a lowering of the brain state, hence providing that permissive function for creativity to flow through, so to speak. The transmissive is the most important, where William James quotes from that great poet Shelley that life, like a dome of many-colored glass, stains the white radiance of eternity. So our thoughts color like colored glass, and glass has a refractive index. It bends the light and splits it up into other colors. So our brains, so to speak, act as a refractive index. So the more we can decolor the colored glass and make it transparent, the more the white radiance of life will be allowed to flow through without being distorted and refracted. So very simply, the brain acts as a transducer of thought in the same way as your radio receiver, your television receiver, transduces the invisible signals from the broadcasting station to something in space and time that's visible, that you can see. So the tiger in your television is not in your room, thank goodness. He's somewhere else. But the brain transduces those signals in that way. But there's some memorable brain studies have again shown that the old idea that you have memory banks like the hard disk of a computer is just not so, because by cutting the brain in half, hopefully not humans, but it's been shown that memory still subsists. So this brings in the whole idea that Rupert Sheldrake deals with so eloquently from a scientific standpoint of the extended mind, that mind and mentality are everywhere, and we tune in to it rather than generate thought.
Well, do you know what you're talking about? I did a study of genius, and until, I mean, I guess the late 19th, early 20th century, genius happened to us. We weren't genius. So you would have, so the genius would pass through you, and it would be from, I mean, the belief system was that it was God that was giving you the ideas, and so the great composers, or so many of them would say that this wasn't my music. This was music that's come through me.
I'm the channel.
Yes. And so in that sense, the energy or the ideas were in the air. And if you look at some of the research also more recently in technology, is how ideas seem to come into people at different parts of the world, but they have the same idea. It's as if the idea is present and then that person brings it down.
Well said, well said. It's as though the idea were like a rain cloud, and people with prepared minds can extend their antenna and bring it down. The finest example in mathematics is the calculus that was independently conceived by Newton and Leibniz, even though that resulted in a great big argy-bargy about who came first. But in music, when an idea is pregnant, prepared minds, and that's so important, prepared minds, people who are thinking about these things will tune into it and extend their antenna and bring it down. Which is why, as you quite rightly said, Jonathan, breakthroughs don't always happen individually, but various people get it in groups, or in very small groups, of course.
Yeah, fascinating. So just to see where we're at now, we've been looking at the benefits and the constraints of modern scientism and of science, and now what we're working towards is an integration of the scientific thinking on one level, and then ensuring that any insights at an individual or molecular or a reductive parts level of an analysis, it can only be truly appreciated if we then indulge in synthesis of bringing everything back together again.
True.
And that's really where we're moving towards now, the mystery teachings. But you also, there's so there's something around the thoughts changing the physical structure and the functioning of our brains, and appreciating a wider viewpoint. I think we've mostly addressed that. Is there anything more you want to say on that area?
Very briefly, Peter Fenwick, the consultant emeritus at the Maudsley and the former president of the Scientific Medical Network and a world-respected authority on near-death experiences, he has told us quite often that meditation has been known to increase the telomeres, which are the outgrowths on the chromosomes, and that increase in the telomeres is an indication of longevity. So when we grow old, apparently those telomeres shrink. But meditation shows, so that's one instance. Another paper.
Just on that, Eddie. So a telomere, just for the listeners, it's as if if you think about the shoelaces that you've got on your shoe, and it's got the plastic coating. The telomere is kind of like that tip. And as we age, or as we experience things, and the more traumatic or challenging that experience, the faster the fraying. So the more time we're tying those laces, I guess, that would be the stressor. And what you're saying is with meditation and that the connecting with something bigger than yourself, which I think is the essence of meditation, is that you're able to repair your own body at the genetic level.
Yes, that's the shoelace analogy is very useful and very apposite, I think. Yeah, and the other clinical study, there is now impressive scientific evidence that certain individuals can radiate light during deep meditative processes and states. And that light is perceived not only by others, but also it's demonstrated through quantitative data of neural correlates during such an induced light experience. So this again relates to changing and affecting the brain structure and chemistry that one can consciously do. So it's not a one way. And also experiments in cooperation with the Dalai Lama have shown the effects of meditation on the brain, and done by American neuroscientists. I think Richard Davidson is his name.
Yes.
Showing functional changes.
And that's from Wisconsin, isn't he?
At Wisconsin, yes, that's right.
Great. So we've been looking at those things. We're looking at these things. Goodness me, just so many things. So you're talking about the light, and we're moving through the books now, and you're talking about the benefits of meditation, and also just that you talk about the correct states of mind. And I guess really just the importance of what you're saying, this integration of science and the mystery teachings, of that actually we can be so much more intelligent if we open ourselves up to, if we cease to see ourselves as individual and separate and being part of something bigger than ourselves. There's resources such as great ideas and energy available to us if we're simply willing to open ourselves up to it. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Brilliant. So I think now, am I right? We've moved through the strengths and challenges and constraints of the current scientific view, but also you've been talking about the way in which science, through the quantum approach, and also the latest insights in science, are showing that this reductive view that's dominated science for the last 100 years or so is now dropping away to reveal a much more integrated view.
Yeah, and the warnings from great scientists, of course, the mystics and sages have ever warned, but it's very important and comforting to see the warnings from enlightened scientists like Einstein and Bertrand Russell on placing the emphasis on being the human being first and foremost. The Russell-Einstein manifesto is what I'm thinking of course. Remember your humanity and forget the rest. Because if you remember your humanity, the way lies open to a new paradise. If you forget your humanity and think of only your technology and science, you run the risk of universal annihilation.
Thank you for watching this video. To explore these ideas further, be sure to visit Shepheard-Walwyn.com and join our mailing list for news and special offers. Check out our authors and buy the books to learn more. And you can also find us on social media. Links are in the description box. So please like the video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's surprisingly helpful in getting our ideas out. So until next time, keep reading.